I want to try to articulate a few ideas that might be pretty challenging but pretty interesting as well, especially if you are dealing with chronic pain, autoimmune disorder, widespread inflammation, and any of the host of things that come along with that, or if you just know someone or work with someone who's dealing with that too. And we're going to weave in quite a few different threads. There's some interesting things. If I think of it and put it together, I'll try and put a resource list down below too. But let's start with the assumption that you are more than just a body plus a mind. And you're more than just a mind-body, whatever that might be. There's something above and beyond that sort of Cartesian dichotomy of mind and body, and we might call it any number of things. We might call it soma, for instance. We might call it the organism or the system. Whatever it is we want to call it, that assumption is going to be pretty key for us to kind of understand what we're going to be digging into here. So, if you're good with that and good with the understanding that there's something above and beyond mind plus body, I'm going to call it the organism. That makes sense to me. But if you're good with that, then we can keep going. So, let's say that the fundamental thing this organism wants to do is perpetuate itself, keep itself alive, and hopefully pass itself on in some form or another to future generations. So how does it go about keeping itself alive? Well, even before we talk about how it does that, we need to understand how it knows what itself is. Because if that organism doesn't know what itself is, it's going to have a hell of a time keeping itself alive. I mean, it's going to be like throwing darts blindfolded. Not going to be a chance. So, how does this organism go about understanding itself? In a sense, mapping itself in the world? In a simplified model, what's kind of going on is that your central nervous system is talking to the rest of your body. It's having this ongoing conversation. And this conversation is in a very different language than English or German or any of these other kind of things. This conversation is going on in a sensory motor language. So what I mean by that is your central nervous system is getting all of this sensory information from your body. Things like pressure and tension, things like hot, cold, things like where your joints are in space, all of this kind of stuff. And it's using this sensory information to actually make sense of itself within the world. So this ongoing conversation is essentially how this organism knows what is it and what is other, what is something else entirely. As we'll come to get to later, this distinction is pretty important, particularly when it comes to, say, an autoimmune disease. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So there's this ongoing conversation in this sensory motor language. So as we're getting sensory information into the central nervous system, we have motor outputs coming out. It's basically anything we do within the world. We move. That's the fundamental means of existing if you're, an animal. But even, on a cellular level. So there's this movement that then introduces new sensory information into the central nervous system. So in a sense, we've got this dynamic storytelling process that's helping this organism learn about itself in relation to the world. We learn what things are pleasurable, what things are unpleasant. We learn what we like, what we dislike, so on and so forth. And again, fundamentally, we learn what is us and what is other. And it's that distinction that helps this organism regulate itself. And I can't overemphasize how important that is. If the organism is unable to determine what is it can't take care of itself. You can't take care of yourself if you don't know what yourself may be. So, this is really important. And I think a lot of people underestimate the importance of it. So, here's where something like chronic pain may come into play. Let's say, for example, that you have an injury, like a knee injury when you're out running, or You have a shoulder injury when you're golfing, or whatever the case may be. You have an injury of some sort. This organism gets a message that something is wrong, that something is going on, and it gets this kind of pain signal manufactured within itself. And so pain at any point in your body basically tells you that something is wrong. But it doesn't tell you the nature of what's wrong, but it does let you know that, hey, within this general context of you in relation to the world, something's wrong. You ought to do something about that. It's a warning signal, or it's a call to pay attention to something and bring about a change. That'll be important later on too. So what your body does pretty instantaneously, reflexively in response to pain, if things are functioning normally, is it will kind of hug around the area, particularly if it's a joint injury. It'll almost hug that area. You'll create a bit of a suit of armor for yourself out of muscular tension. That's why, if something hurts, it's going to feel stiff afterwards, right? So that stiffness is actually a pretty good thing. It's a protective mechanism. Again, this organism is trying to perpetuate itself. It's trying to regulate itself. It's trying to keep itself alive in the world. And so if it perceives that something bad is going on there, it's going to condense. It's going to keep that stuff from moving more so that we reduce the risk of further injury in that area, of further damaging those tissues or those structures. So when things are going well, that stiffness keeps us from moving that area until it has recovered. But what often happens is, out of a sense of compulsion or just being stubborn or any number of things, we push a bit past that. We push into pain. We ignore the signals our body is sending us. We don't allow the organism time to heal and recover fully. So what happens then is that pain almost encodes itself within this organism, on the level of your nervous system, on the level of the tissues as well. We get a very real manifestation of that just pushing into pain kind of thing. So, in a sense, your body starts to learn that certain things are painful. Now, this can linger even after that injury itself has gone away. That's where something like chronic pain comes into play. If, for example, it hurts for me to do this, and I pop a painkiller and continue to do this, or, I just do this even if it's painful, my body's going to learn that this is painful. It will learn that lesson. So what happens then? Well, we learn that that's painful. And pain, of course, is probably the loudest signal. It's the loudest sensory information that our body's going to get. Pain will be louder volume-wise than things like, tension, pressure, all of these other sensory things. The only signal that our central nervous system may be getting is pain. So we start to dissociate that. If we don't let pain resolve itself, if we don't let the organism heal and recover, we start to dissociate that part of the body. It's like if I were just blinking a flashlight next to you. Over time, unless you resolve that stimulus, you're just going to ignore it. You're going to tune it out. We do the same thing with pain. If we get this ongoing chronic kind of signaling that there's pain, eventually our bodies numb themselves. Here's where that gets to be a problem. Let's say there's a room in your house that you don't like, and you decide, I'm just going to wall up the doorway. I'm going to brick the doorway full so that we don't even have to look at it. That doesn't make the room go away just because you don't like it. That's still a room that exists within your house. And the problem is that it's a room that exists within your house that might have a drip. And that drip might start to mold. And that mold might cause the ceiling to collapse. And you might get cockroaches and rats that start to infest that room. And it's still a part of your house, even though you don't know all of that stuff is going on. You've bricked up that doorway. You've numbed yourself to whatever that stimulus is. So, in the case of chronic pain, we might get a numbness. We might just turn off that signaling and dissociate from that part of the body. And yet, it's still a part of the body. It's still there, even though it's uncomfortable. And this is why so often when people start to get into movement practice or mindfulness practice or any of this sort of stuff, it's an uncomfortable process. In essence, that's like knocking down that brick wall and seeing that you've got a shit-filled, moldy rat nest of a room in your house. Like, it couldn't be ugly at the start. And yet, dealing with that ugliness is the only way to restore wholeness to your house or to your system. We might get uncomfortable on the way to getting better, particularly if we're dealing with something like chronic pain. Now, here's the other interesting thing that can happen. If we dissociate from our body, we start to tell this organism that that's not a part of itself anymore, right? Like if I dissociate from my shoulder, I'm essentially telling my body, that shoulder, it's ugly. I don't want that in part of the house. It's not part of me anymore. But here's the thing, this organism, again, is trying to perpetuate itself. It's trying to keep itself alive. And what happens when that organism perceives a foreign entity? In immunology, it's like an antigen. What happens when there's an antigen in the system? Well, we trigger an immune response. Here's where that distinction gets really important. Anything that our bodies, our organisms perceive as other, one of two things can happen. Either we find a way to digest that thing, integrate it within ourselves, or we alienate it, we eliminate it. It passes out the other end in some cases, but that immune response, that inflammatory response, that crops up in response to things that are perceived as other. And that's not a bad thing. That's a pretty good thing, actually. But here's the catch. Evolutionarily, our immune systems are primed to be a little overprotective because it's better to deal with like runny nose and stuff than let a rhinovirus infect you and give you something way beyond your ability to cope. Like evolution is a pretty conservative thing. So evolutionarily, it's good to be a bit overprotective, be a bit hyper reactive, than to let something slip in that could really do us some harm. So we're primed to be a little sensitive to these things, even if in fact they're not like, warranting full-scale alarm bells kind of going off. So this is where there's an interesting tie-in to autoimmune issues and widespread, seemingly illogical, for no good reason kind of inflammation. It's like that has a purpose. Your body is fighting off something that it perceives as not a part of itself, and yet it's not something that it can get rid of. This organism can't just get rid of your shoulder despite all of the immune response that might be triggered by it. It has to, in order to resolve this ongoing tension, in order to resolve this conflict, we have to find a way back to wholeness. We have to find a way to assimilate and reintegrate that shoulder into our central nervous system's map of the body, into this organism's sense of self. So, how do we go about doing that? Well, even before we talk about that, let's just give a quick recap. So, if our body or our organism doesn't perceive a part of itself as itself, it's a perfectly logical kind of response to trigger an inflammatory response or an immune response. Of course, that's a bit of a vicious cycle, right? Because inflammation can increase sensation of pain in the area. And if there's already pain, then it's like, again, we might want to tune that out at a certain point. So it's critical that we take this cycle back, that we stop this vicious circle from continuing. Because again, what happens if it's painful and it hurts? Well, we don't use it. And if we don't use it, we don't get that sensory information going to the central nervous system. And this whole damn cycle continues. So we need to find a way to get back to integrated use of the self. if we want to have any prayer of a halfway decent life. So how do we go about doing that? The first step seems to be awareness. It's like we have to know that something is going on in order to do something. I'm pretty fond of saying that awareness is the fundamental ingredient for making a change come about, a deliberate change, let's say. So we might start simply by tuning in to what kind of sensations you notice within yourself. And again, this might not be a comfortable thing. You know, it's quite a bit easier to numb out painful and uncomfortable sensations than to listen to them. I'm not going to tell you what I'm drinking. I don't want to deal with sponsorship stuff, whatever. So, we have to pay attention to whatever signals we're getting, even if they're uncomfortable. In order to deal with that shit rat-infested room in the house, we have to look at it. We have to see it. We have to get a grasp on what the problem actually is. So even though it's an uncomfortable process, we can't shy away from this stuff. We have to tune in to what's going on within our organism. So, in the case of an injury, or really in any case, you might start just lying somewhat comfortably on the ground and tuning into what sensations crop up in your body. Start with the obvious ones. Some people start with the breath. I don't think that's a great place to start with an awareness practice. Start with like the obvious stuff, like where are you in contact with the ground? Like where do you feel pressure against the ground? Interesting side note, this pressure, this weight sense, that's like the very first kind of organismic sensation that helps us differentiate between self and other. Like, there's a reason babies are so active and so engaged in like trying to engage with the world. If you don't engage with the world, you don't exist. Like, literally, like the map of yourself, your self-image becomes so blurred because you haven't butted up against anything. You absolutely must engage with the world if you want to exist. So, awareness is a pretty good first step. And awareness of where you're in contact with other is a really good step. So, where do you feel contact with the ground underneath you? And where don't you feel contact correspondingly? So if you're lying on the ground, maybe you feel, pressure along the main body weight centers, the head, the shoulder girdle, and the rib basket, down to the pelvis as well. Maybe you feel pressure in each arm at certain points, like the elbow or the hand, maybe the upper arm. If your legs are out long, maybe you feel a bit of pressure under your thighs, or maybe not. And perhaps you feel pressure under your heels. Or if your legs are bent, maybe you feel that pressure under the soles of the feet. It's a pretty good place to start. Because again, awareness helps us map ourselves within the world. And I wish on YouTube I could hyphenate that, you within the world, because that's a pretty potent phrase. So after you've started to tune in to where you feel pressure, where you feel contact with some other, you might begin to tune into what kind of sensations you notice within yourself. And I want to give a caveat, because I don't know you, and I don't know anything about your experience of the world. If this is a touchy area, don't push into this. If at any time you feel uncomfortable with this process, don't push it. Same as we don't want to push into pain. In a sense, we're dealing with a wounded animal. And you don't push a wounded animal. You let that animal heal. You give it space. You approach it gently, and you allow it to get comfortable with you. You can tame it that way. So don't push this if it's uncomfortable. Particularly if we're dealing with, the whole gamut of emotional trauma as well. This can be a really difficult practice, a really challenging practice, and it's useful to have qualified person-to-person kind of facilitation. So Don't let this video get in the way of that by any means, please. But so if you're okay carrying forward, you might start to tune into what you notice about yourself. Like, are there places where you feel comfortable or uncomfortable? Are there places where you notice tension within yourself? Are there any places you notice that you're holding yourself? Because make no mistake, muscular tension, even though it might not seem like it right off the bat, it's not something that's happening to you. It's something you do to yourself. You are the agent of your muscular tension. Perhaps not consciously, but on an organismic level, you're holding yourself. So are there places where you're holding yourself? And then you might just ask yourself, in a broad sense, hey, could I let that go? Do I need to hold that? Or, since I feel support of the ground underneath me, could I let that go? And what you'll find, the longer you spend within this awareness practice, the richer it gets, particularly if you practice it consistently, day after day, week after week. You find more and more. And here's why that's so important. You find out more and more. And I just think this is so cool. Anytime we come across novelty, new information, new stuff, whether it's about ourselves or about the world, we break down, we dissolve some prior understanding, some prior map, and we can reintegrate that novelty into a more encompassing picture. Think of it in terms of food. You take a bite, you chew it, you digest it, and the building blocks of that food, you assimilate them. They become the building blocks of you. And we do this with information too. You're doing this right now. Like, we take ideas and we break down our understanding and we integrate a new level of organization that encompasses what we used to know plus what we just learned. That's learning, fundamentally. So here's where this gets so rich. If you practice this awareness work consistently over time, it's like you learn more and more new stuff about yourself or what you thought of as yourself. And it's like each time you learn something new, then there's this chance for you to come up with something beyond this. It's like this sense of self plus this new stuff becomes this new, broader sense of self. And then there's something else new, and it's like maybe you eat that information too. And so the map you have of yourself is getting richer and more encompassing, and it's getting just more and more nuanced and more true, in a sense. And that seems important. It's getting to be a more whole understanding of yourself. And everything you're ever going to do in your life, it's you doing it. So it seems pretty important to have as well-rounded an understanding of yourself as you're able to. You are yourself throughout the entirety of your life, so it seems reasonable to understand yourself as well as you can. And fundamentally, above and beyond and beneath and throughout all of the self-inquiry, self-study stuff, it's like body practice is the fundamental way of understanding self within the world. Again, if we circle back to the infants, they're moving, they're exploring, they're trying to eat everything they can get their hands on. It's like they're learning, they're discovering what they are and how they are within the world. And so that seems to be the next step. We've got this awareness practice. You've knocked down some of the bricks of that wall that you've built up. You now can see all the shit that you've got to deal with. And it doesn't get better on its own. Letting it do its thing is what got you here in the first place. So we need to engage a again, unless you engage, you don't exist. So we have to engage with that mess that we may uncover. We have to engage with those uncomfortable sensations we may notice, that pain, that tension. We have to engage with that. So fundamentally, how do we engage? This was really good. So fundamentally, how do we engage? We engage through movement. Movement is how we engage with the world. So as you're tuning into your stuff, whatever that stuff may be, let's say you sense tension, can you engage with that tension? For example, if you notice your neck is tense, and you've asked yourself, like, do I need to be tense there? Do I need to hold myself? Maybe you do. That's the thing. Again, our organism, they don't mess around. Like, they're not doing it just because. There's a reason you're tense. The juicy part is figuring out why. So, can you engage with it? It's kind of like having a conversation with your body in that sensory motor language, although it's a deliberate conversation, now that you've taken the time to listen to it. So, engage it. Movement, fundamentally, is like a muscular contraction. And that's like the basis of all movements we go through. So, that tension that you feel, could you contract into that tension? If you notice that you're tense in your neck, could you engage that tension a little bit more? Like, if these muscles are squeezing already, could we squeeze into them a little bit more? And slowly, could you let go of that? It's almost like we're having a call and response with the body. It's like we talk to it in a language it understands. We contract gently, carefully. We're not trying to shout in this conversation. And then we, release. We let that go. And then we listen to what new sensations come up. So this contract and release, this engaging with the body, each time we do that, each time there's the response to the call and response, we're getting new sensory information. We're mapping ourselves. We're helping our organism reintegrate itself. You actually don't need to do a whole lot more than that. Like, your organism has an innate desire for wholeness and for regulation of the self. And so if you give it this sensory information, it will learn about itself. You don't have to beat it over the head and teach it something. You don't have to quiz it on if it learned that. It learns faster than anything you can believe. Like, it's a learning system. You are a learning system in the broadest, profoundest sense of that phrase. So, this awareness, this subtle engagement, this can go a long, long way in helping your organism develop a more well-rounded and refined understanding of itself. That's why it's so effective for things like chronic pain. That's why it can be so effective for things like autoimmune issues or broad spread inflammation. It's like we're helping the organism tap into its innate self-regulatory capacity. And there's something pretty profound about that. So, this is by no means a how-to guide, and it's not a comprehensive look by any means. But I do realize that the video is getting a little long. So, I hope at the very least it's given you some interesting ideas to consider. It's given you maybe a broader and a richer understanding of yourself. And I hope that if you can put some of these ideas into practice, that it can carry you a long, long way. So I should also say I'm puzzling through a lot of this stuff myself. Lately, working with a couple of clients remotely, some interesting things have come up, and that's kind of why I wanted to make this video in the first place. It was selfish. I wanted to articulate these ideas because, again, engaging with stuff that we don't fully understand, that's how we understand it. We have to engage with difficult stuff in order to wrangle it, to grasp it. So that's why I did this, but I do hope it has been useful too. My clients seem to think it was. So, anyhow, if you have questions, drop them in the comment box below. I'm not sure where all I'll put this, but if there's an option to subscribe, probably do that. I'd like to make more videos like this too. Or, like it, share it, the social media stuff. Spread good ideas. There's enough bullshit out there. We need more good stuff. So if you liked it, spread the word. And again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. This is a really juicy kind of train of thought. So I'm excited to see what we make of it.